Hey, Steve. Very nice to have you here. How
Thanks
are
for
you?
having me.
Good. Can you tell us a bit about how you've been working on conspiracy theories and how that relates to COVID-19?
Well, I'm a cognitive scientist, as you know, and so I study how people think. And many years ago now, I think about 10 years ago, I became interested in conspiracy theories because of their role in denying well-established science. And I started studying this, and basically what I discovered is that regardless of what scientific domain you're talking about, whenever people deny science, they almost invariably, sooner or later, resort to conspiracy theories. And you find that with people who reject vaccinations, you find it with people who deny climate change, and you now find it with people who are denying the risks from COVID or are denying the measures that we have to take against this disease.
So we can definitely state that conspiracy theories are a problem around COVID-19.
Oh, I think so, absolutely. And here in the UK, unfortunately, one conspiracy theory about COVID has led people to blow up cell phone towers,
Yeah,
mobile
we've
phone
had that
towers.
here as well. Yeah,
We
yeah.
had that there as well because of this idea that 5G somehow is responsible for COVID, which is, of course, complete and utter nonsense.
But and that's what's terrifying and fascinating at the same time is how do people get to that point that they start believing that? And uh, can we sort of specify certain techniques that lead to people starting to believe conspiracy theories?
Well, the first thing that we have to recognize is that conspiracy theories almost inevitably result from any kind of crisis in a person's personal life or in public life where they get a sense of having lost control over their lives. And that can be a personal tragedy or it can be a massive event such as a pandemic. And, there's nothing new here because in the Middle Ages, every time there was a pandemic, conspiracy theories erupted and expressed themselves, usually, in hostility towards others. Through anti Semitism, for example, that's always an old fallback. So there's nothing surprising because when people are frightened and feel that they've lost control, then believing in a conspiracy ironically gives people a sense of control. And at first glance, that might seem weird. How is a conspiracy helping me thinking of being in control? But when you unpack that a little more, what you find is that if there really were a conspiracy responsible for a terrible event, then at least in your mind, you can sort of counterfactually simulate that the world would be a better place if those bad people had not been so bad.
It gives a sort of closure.
It's a sense of, yeah, closure and also just that it could have been different.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are these bad people out there who I now really, really hate. But, if they weren't there, the world would be a better place. That, for some people, that gives them more of a sense of control than saying, oh my God, a bat sneezed in a cave in China, and now 6 months later, the world is coming to an end, or whatever. It won't come to an end.
Yeah.
The fear is there. And for some people, that's extremely hard to accept, that random events, arbitrary events can have dramatic consequences.
And if we look at the combination of conspiracies and disinformation, do we see actors that actively spread intentionally?
Yes.
And how does that work, or what can you say about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, misinformation and conspiracy theories are a market like any other market. There is a supply and there is a demand. And if there's no demand, then it doesn't matter how much supply there is. So outside of a pandemic, I think this 5G conspiracy theory would have not gained any traction because why would anybody believe this if they're not in a position where they feel they've lost control? And the 5G example is actually a good one, because if you look at the origin of that theory, then it turns out that about a year ago, more than a year ago, not the particular COVID conspiracy, but a variant of that was pushed onto the internet by Twitter accounts affiliated with Russia. And the New York Times actually ran a report on this more than a year ago, way before COVID came along, that there were these systematic attempts to inject a conspiracy theory about 5G into the public discourse. So that was the supply side. The theory was provided, and then it was sort of dormant until COVID came along, and then it took off because all of a sudden people were receptive to that. So we do have a supply and demand side, and I mean the 5G thing is just one example. Another example that's very interesting is in Australia. There is an individual who is peddling conspiracy theories about COVID, who is also at the same time selling the cure. So, which of course isn't a cure. It is just some, grape juice or something that he filters through a magic pot, or whatever. And the guy is a former chef, and he has quite a public profile in Australia, and he is literally making money out of his own conspiracy theories. So, there are entrepreneurs out there who are saying these things because it's for their own profit sometimes, or simply to have the greatest reward of them all, which is attention.
And how do they get that attention? I mean, what do they use in their messaging that gets people their attention and hooks them to their stories?
Yeah, very, very good question. My impression is that what happens is that there are platforms on the internet where ideas like that are systematically generated and tested out. And then some ideas disappear, they're never heard from again, and other ideas make it out of these small circles and onto Facebook, and then onto Twitter, and then into politics. The best example for that is the pizza conspiracy, Pizzagate in the United States. I don't know if you remember that, but the idea, this ludicrous idea, was launched on Facebook that the Democrats are running a child sex ring out of the basement of a pizza joint in Washington. Well, the pizza joint doesn't have a basement, and the Democrats most certainly didn't run a child sex slave ring out of that. And nonetheless, it was believed sufficiently for one guy to walk into this restaurant and fire an automatic rifle, as Americans do when they, get agitated. Now that arose in one of these chat rooms on the far right of the internet, and it then made its way out onto Facebook. It was then picked up by the president's son. One of the Trumps retweeted some tweet alerting others to this, and it then went from there, and now everybody in the world pretty much knows about Pizzagate and the fallout from that. And it came from a discussion that also involved lots of other ideas, but they just weren't deemed attractive. So I think it is sort of a selection by it's an evolutionary process. People.
But is it always the story that has the power, or is it also the rhetorical fallacies making that story that has an impact?
Well, interesting question. I mean, when we look at conspiracy theories, then of course they're always tapping into people's paranoias and suspicions, and they're always accusing the conspirators of nefarious intent. So any theory will tap into some dark suspicion that people have, either about the government or scientists or the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly that is an aspect of their people, receptivity, or their success, is that they tap into that. And the way they are formulated is indeed always characterized by cognitive flaws. I mean, it's almost by definition. It has to be the case that a conspiracy theory, certainly when it's aimed against science, well, it has to be flawed in some way because, otherwise there would be a scientific debate. But if there is no scientific debate, if we all know that COVID was caused by a virus, well, then to say otherwise almost necessarily implies that you have to indulge in some cognitive flaw. And
Because
and again,
well,
it's easily illustrated. I mean, there's this movie going around, unfortunately, that is pretending that COVID was actually planned out by, well, it's probably the U.S. government, to make millions of dollars somehow from dead people. I don't know how that works, but that's sort of the hypothesis underlying the movie. And they're making two totally incoherent claims in this movie. On the one hand, the person who's espousing these conspiracy theories is saying, well, we've all had the virus all along. We got them when we were vaccinated as children. And now it's activated because we're wearing masks. Okay? Now, that's complete nonsense, of course, because we got the pandemic before people started wearing masks. And, of course, we don't get that virus through vaccination. So it's complete nonsense. But what the same person is also saying, within minutes of the first claim, that this is a biological weapon that was unleashed on the world by a laboratory in China. Well, it's either one or the other, but it can't be both. And this incoherence, now, of course, in this case, it's neither, but logically, one or the other could be true, but not both. And this incoherence is a hallmark of conspiracy theory.
But it doesn't seem to matter in some way. No, it
does not seem to matter because, again, the conspiracy theory is feeding into this deep need to find something at fault with the official account, which is in this case the science, combined with having enemies that one can blame for this. So the twin purpose is, first of all, to feed into the paranoia, but then also to offer that illusion of sense of control.
And then often you hear the very reasonable response that, but at least they should look into it, and they haven't looked into it good enough.
Well, of course, there you go. That's a classic. There's no evidence for my conspiracy theory. Well, therefore, it has to be true because they haven't looked hard enough, or they're hiding their tracks so well it must be a conspiracy. Yeah.
But that is one of the two things that I've seen mainly also in WhatsApp messages spreading around in groups here in the Netherlands, where either the introduction was very personal, like I've heard this from my husband's nephew and I'm sharing this with you now so that you know the truth. Yeah. And the other thing is, and maybe you can tell more about that, the technique of just asking questions.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I would be prepared to question whether that person really heard it from their nephew or husband's nephew or whatever, or whether that is just a rhetorical device to give it credibility. Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the second point? Oh, just asking questions. Yes, of course, just asking questions. I mean,
there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Well, actually, there is. And one example that comes to mind are these conspiracy theories that arose around Sandy Hook, the mass shooting where a lot of these children in the United States were killed by somebody who went on a rampage with an automatic rifle. And there, the conspiracy theorists were saying, oh, okay, that never happened. First of all, they then said that the crying relatives were crisis actors. They were just hired to display this grief, and the children are still alive somewhere else. And then their way of justifying the theory was not by providing evidence, but by raising 120 questions. That they said, well, I just want to have these questions resolved. Why did the policeman not tie his shoelaces that morning? Why did the 911 recorder clear their throat while they were talking? That was a secret code. And you can dress that up as questions to generate doubt. without having any substance whatsoever. And I think that's very important to recognize for members of the public, that the moment people say, oh, I'm just asking questions, but they never accept any answers, or they're designing questions that are just not terribly relevant, then you can be pretty sure that it's a conspiracy theory.
And what happens after? I mean, what is the effect of just asking questions in that case?
Well, most people won't bother to respond. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I would instead talk about, well, we have a real problem here, because people who do that are not doing the public a service, because we know from quite a bit of research that the mere exposure to conspiracy theories has adverse consequences on people and society at large. There's quite a lot of research done by a colleague of mine, Karen Douglas, who shows that if people are exposed to a conspiracy theory, they'll reduce their political engagement, they'll reduce their willingness to reduce their carbon footprint, and so on. There's a number of consequences of the mere exposure to conspiracy theories that are negative for society. So, no one is doing anyone a favor by spreading these conspiracy theories. And as we've already said, ultimately people may start blowing up communications installations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have the feeling that because of that personal connection that people try to create in the introduction, either by stating this is really secret and I'm sharing this only with you, or by saying yes, but I know you, so you should trust me. That it actually pulls in a lot of people that you normally wouldn't think of that would believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And again, absolutely, yeah, no, I'm quite prepared to believe that. I think it's the numbers that get drawn in aren't, you never get the majority of people, but you will get a substantial portion of the people to believe in this. I think here in the United Kingdom, the latest paper suggests about 10% of the people believe in one conspiracy theory or another, which is, a surprisingly large number, absolutely. But again, it's only against the background of a situation where people think that they've lost control. Under normal circumstances, if some dude sends you a WhatsApp that says, the moon is made of green cheese and they're hiding it from you, well, you're probably not going to believe that.
But at the same time, you can, we do have a real crisis now, but you can also create a fictive crisis that just lives in people's minds.
Indeed. And absolutely, and we can do that in the laboratory. There's research done in the Netherlands, actually, that shows that you can get people in the laboratory to experience a loss of control. And whenever they do that, they then instantly become more accepting of potential conspiracy theories. So we can, you can even manipulate that in an experiment in the laboratory.
Wow.
It's all about the sense of control people have. So
what
we have to do is to try and give people a sense of control and say that, well, actually, you can make a difference if you wear a mask, and you stay home as much as possible, and you practice social distancing, and you don't visit your grandparents. Then we do control this virus. And, that's why I'm very pleased that the way things are going in New Zealand and Australia, where they've got the virus under control. New Zealand eradicated the virus by dealing with it early on and having a very serious lockdown, and they're now completely through.
But of course, there's a conspiracy theory to explain that, probably.
Well,
it was all a plan from New Zealand from the start,
it was
maybe.
All planned from the outset. Yeah, well, okay, that would be the first conspiracy theory ever to admit about something positive. A success of dealing with the virus. But I think the point is that does give us a sense of, that yes, okay, we can deal with this if we do it right. And of course, we have to do it early on. It's I think in the US they'll find it's going to be much, much harder now to deal with this because the virus has spread so much further.
And does private messaging and Facebook and the other social media platforms contribute to the ease with which people receive
Yes,
conspiracy theories.
certainly. And yeah, absolutely. But there are some interesting points in this as well. The first one is that what Facebook, to their credit, is now doing with the COVID pandemic is to overlay any misinformation about the virus with a gray mask that makes the content almost invisible, and a warning that says, "Hey, this is not true. Don't go there." Now, people can still click through to the content, but it turns out, so it's not censorship in that sense. It's just flagging the content. But it turns out that cuts sharing of those messages by 95%. In comparison to a control where that mask wasn't present. So it's extremely effective. Zuckerberg wrote a blog post about that, and I talked to the people within Facebook who did the experiment, and they assured me there was a control and it was all done in the proper way. So that's probably reliable. So there are things we can do about it. And the other thing I want to mention in this context, since you mentioned it earlier, is WhatsApp. WhatsApp is very interesting because it was implicated, I don't know if you know this, in mob violence and murders in India about 2 years ago. When people spontaneously, well, not spontaneously, summoned by WhatsApp, people congregated and murdered completely innocent visitors to the village who happened to drive through based on being incited by a fake video via WhatsApp. And one of the things that facilitated this was that it was extremely easy to spread things to multiple people on WhatsApp. So things went viral in no time at all. What WhatsApp did as a countermeasure was to limit the number of chats you can forward a message to 5. And they also identified it as a message that's being forwarded rather than something that seems to come from you. Because previously, it looked at any message forwarded seemed to come from the person who forwarded it, when in fact it was from somewhere completely different. Now, it's extremely difficult to attribute causality to this because it's not really an experiment. But that stopped, or at least since they did that, there have been no further incidents of mob violence, whereas previously they were recurring, 60 people killed or something, or, it was a large number of incidents that kept occurring, and the police were powerless. Well, those two changes to WhatsApp seems to have cut out the violence, at least to the best of our knowledge. There hasn't been anything.
Until now, yeah.
Until now. So, of course, again, I have to be very careful in not overstating that. But I think it goes to show how the social media companies can make a difference and how sometimes even small changes can make a big difference to society.
And as a last question, always when stuff like this happens, like this real crisis, and we see the need for vaccinations, I mean, we can only open up the whole world again when we have a vaccine. At that point, I always think now people have to admit that vaccinations are good, and the anti-vax movement will come to realize that they've been wrong all this time. Somehow that never happens. What do you expect, and how do you explain that?
Well, I think I think you have to differentiate between people very carefully, and that's always true with conspiracy theories generally. There are some people who firmly believe in them, become part of their identity, and they're not going to change their mind, short of an intensive kind of therapy, pretty much. They will not change their mind. However, there's a lot of other people who may just sort of engage in conspiracy theorizing because it's kind of convenient. They just say that's a throwaway remark, oh, climate change is a hoax, and then you can go on your holiday to Bali or whatever. Those people are very much reachable by messages and by corrections. And so what I think will happen if and when we get a vaccine is that actually a large number of people will vaccinate and will forget about their opposition to vaccination simply because all of a sudden their health or their lives are at stake. and they will fall in line. I'm quite convinced that that is what's going to happen. However, there will be a hardcore of people who will vociferously oppose vaccines, even if it saves their lives, because of a commitment to this idea, and because of ideology, and because of, they're
So
just
we
too
can say for sure that not a single argument, fact, or correction will ever sort of magically change the ideology of the hardcore conspiracy thinker.
Absolutely. Not a single message, not a single communication. Absolutely not at all. On the contrary, they might become more entrenched in their beliefs. But fortunately, we're talking about a very small number of people.
Yeah.
The crucial thing is to make sure that they remain small and that they're not, spreading this on social media too far. And that is why the measure by Facebook now to superimpose false information with a mask is a good move in that direction. And so I'm actually, I'm more worried about not having a vaccine than having it and then worry about people not taking it. I think once there's a vaccine on the market and, the first, few million people have got it and they're out there partying like nothing ever happened, I think, a lot of others will
follow.
I think life before COVID was pretty attractive for many of us.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Okay, thank you. It was great talking to you.
Great. Hey, see you later. Bye. Bye.